Hi there, welcome back to 2021. This is NMRA X with me, Speed, at the bottom of the helix. Our next technician is from Northville in Michigan. He is a lifelong model railroader and a Pennsylvania Railroad fan. He achieved his MMR status in 2012 and is currently the Central District Director on the National NMRA Board. If you would like to know how to weather a steam era freight car, please pay attention. We welcome Mr. Bill Neale.
Thank you, Speed. I appreciate it. My job today is to be just interesting enough to keep everybody tuned in for the really good clinics that follow mine. So we'll work toward that direction. Let me share my screen here, and we'll get rolling. Yeah, there we go. Share. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. I use this slide as a good introduction to what I'm working on and where my interests are. This is a painting from 1953 that was done for the Pennsylvania Railroad's calendars. They used to hand those out to all their major customers, and they're quite a collector's item. This one depicts the Pennsylvania Railroad's Panhandle Division crossing the Ohio River. We're on the West Virginia side, and across the river is Steubenville, Ohio. And this is the area I happen to model. I actually have a model of this bridge, in fact, on my model railroad. The poignant part about this calendar slide, though, this calendar picture, is that this is the last time a steam locomotive was actually shown on the Pennsylvania Railroad calendar. They kind of put one way back in the background on the right-hand side there, going up the Ohio River. But this is the area I'm interested in, and I actually modeled in 1939, so it's right in the heart of the steam era. And I've spent a lot of time looking at how things should look and that sort of stuff, and I want to share some of the techniques I've used. So we're going to talk about freight car weathering. And I want to make sure you understand that this clinic is derivative. In other words, there's no real new techniques here. I've derived a lot of my styles, a lot of my techniques from stuff that I've seen other people do. And it's also additive. In other words, if you're weathering things today, don't throw all that stuff away and just follow me. Add some of my techniques if you find them interesting to what you're doing today. This is not an end-all, be-all clinic on weathering. It's just a good way to approach some of the freight car weathering in the steam era. So let's talk about steam eras. And really, I'm talking about the late steam era. I mean, there were steam engines around since 1820, but they're relatively small. What I'm focused on is that the major period of time that most folks in model railroading focus on as well, and that is the transition era, or just around the two world wars. And it was a pretty dirty time. One of the things that's most remarkable about this period is that at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw a revolution in motive power size. We switched from the little tea kettles, the 460s and the 440s, and started running Mikados and Mountains and 210-2s and that sort of thing. Locomotive size virtually doubled overnight, and so did the train size. What was the impact? Well, of course, passing sidings had to be longer, yards had to be changed, turntables and engine houses had to be replaced. But right along with it came this increased dirt and dust and coal smoke. Two pictures at the bottom are Pittsburgh in the 1940s. And you can see it was a pretty nasty place. Dirt and coal smoke all over the place. In fact, Pittsburgh ran their streetlights 24/7 because it was so dim there. You may say, oh, I don't model this area. I model someplace else. Well, the fact is almost all freight cars would roll through this area, all North American freight cars at some point in time. I mean, 1945, if you measured it by car loadings, the Pennsylvania Railroad served 45% of American industry. So that meant that more than likely we're getting cars from or going to this dirty area. And not only just Pennsylvania, New York Central, Baltimore, Ohio, Erie, all the major Eastern North American railroads probably ran through this mess. And it affects the way we look at our cars. You know, I mean, even this is a photograph of Amarillo, Texas, where things should be nice and clean. You got the open air and that kind of stuff. But if you look at these freight cars, they're all pretty doggone dirty. So it doesn't necessarily have a geographic differentiation. I think most freight cars in the steam era were fairly dirty. So steam era is characterized by this massive increase in locomotive size, by the smokestack industries all around, providing this great increase in grime and smoke and cinders and grease and so on and so forth. Plus, we also have a really widely varied levels of maintenance on the rolling stock. I mean, if you look at it, you have this, maybe a 20-year period of high growth with increasing traffic, and accompanied by this enormous amount of locomotive growth. And then suddenly we drop into the Depression era, where we have a good 10, 11 years of deferred maintenance, and people just didn't take care of things. They didn't have the money or the manpower to do so. And suddenly we get slammed by the war years, where we have this extraordinary traffic effort, and it also created huge amounts of wear and tear on rolling stock. I mean, if you look at pictures of some of the rolling stock from 1945, it looks just worn out. And then you have this decline of freight traffic from 45 to 60, where railroads were replacing steam engines by diesels. But you didn't see a lot of this until maybe the mid 50s, where it really started to have an impact in terms of how things looked. So why weather? I know there's always that discussion about, well, I like things nice and clean, but I personally like the way things look when they're weathered, when they have a nice grungy look to them and they look realistic. I mean, we spent a lot of time arguing about which way the goat faces on a Great Northern boxcar in 1952, but we don't weather our cars to match the way the doggone thing looked in 1952. So I tend to think things should look pretty grungy and pretty weathered. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to take a couple, look at a couple prototype pictures. Then I'm going to go over some basic paints and colors I use, and you can kind of look over my shoulder when I do a couple cars. And then I'll show you some of my other tricks and maybe discuss some weathering sins that we should watch out for. And if I have enough time, we'll wind up with some examples for inspiration. I always like that. By the way, look at the back end of this locomotive. It's kind of interesting. Those are not rust spots. That's actually brake shoe dust. Brake shoes are iron, and when they get worn, when they're used, they spray a lot of iron oxide around. So it's kind of interesting how the coloration turns out. Okay, well, there's a problem with steam era, particularly earlier steam eras, and that is we don't really have a good color palette. A lot of black and white photos show up. You can tell certain things from pictures like this, like how the paint's failing on the roof of this car, or how the roof walk's been replaced down here in the car in the foreground on the right-hand side. But overall, it's really hard to detect the color palette. You have to really scratch around and find pictures, and you can. I mean, they're out there. One of these days, I'm going to build this Southern car. I really like the look of it. Nice wood sides that are faded, and they've obviously replaced the doors just very recently. So it's an interesting look. I kind of like the way it sets out here. By the way, this is a good picture of the way a rip track should look too. All this brake equipment sitting here on pallets and that sort of thing. So let's talk about the obvious stuff. How does weathering happen? Well, real simple. The steam locomotive supplies cinders and ash and soot that falls on the top of the car. Of course, you get sanding dust, brake shoe dust, which is rusty in color, and just general grime and earth tones coming up on the bottom. Then, of course, bearing grease coming off the wheels. Most of the trucks were friction bearing back then. And you have a lot of end splatter. And, of course, you have some intentional human stuff that gets added to the car that really helps with weathering. Now, this clinic is not going to touch much on the intentional human stuff. There's a lot of good articles about that, like such things as chalk marks and other writings and bits of paper attached to tack boards. That really helps the look, but I'm not going to touch that too much today. I want to talk a minute about the way wheels should look. Friction bearings were basically had a lid on the top of it here, and they would put oily cotton waste in the bottom. The axle would turn through that waste, lift the oil up, and it would pass through the brass bearing on the top. It was a pretty good system, worked pretty well as long as this was oily. But that oil would leak out through the back of the bearing and get all over the face of the wheel. So within maybe 2 or 3 miles, most wheels had this oily face that attracted dirt like crazy. So you have this ugly, nasty, dirty-looking wheel, not shiny at all. So that's one of the things that I think is most important. If you get nothing else out of this clinic, paint your wheel faces. Now, the wheel tread would be shiny, but not the wheel face. Here's another great shot. One of the things you notice about a lot of these old shots is how the paint begins to fail on the top of boxcars. That was galvanized steel, whereas the sides were regular steel. And paints in the 40s and 50s were not that good. They didn't stick very well to galvanized metal. So one of the things that happens quite often is boxcars losing their paint. This is a great shot of an inside of a gondola too, how rusty and nasty it looks. I like that picture. Here's another great shot from I think this is from 1940, out west, or near the Chicago, maybe near the Chicago. You can see how the grime has combined with the red boxcar paint to turn these guys almost a purpley color. There's some wood fading in here. That's really interesting. You can tell from the Chicago Northwestern. Sometimes the Chicago Northwestern was known as the cheap and nothing wasted railroad. But here they've repainted a car recently. You can see how quickly it would fade to a lighter color, though. It worked pretty fast. And also in this neat picture is some very interesting dirty refrigerator cars back there. I like refrigerator cars, but I like them dirty too. I'll show you. In fact, that's one of the cars we're going to look over my shoulder at as I weather a refrigerator car. Now here's another 1940s picture. You can see here how the roof walks weather. These are just timbers left out in the woods, out in the weather rather, not in the woods, in the weather. And generally they turn gray. Not much paint was wasted on them either. You can catch the end splatters here. That's kind of interesting, and how the couplers looked. It's a good photograph to look at in terms of color use. Now here's one of my favorite pictures from the Jack Delano slide set from Chicago. Look at these refrigerator cars, and in particular, look at how the timbers stand out board by board and how dark the area is in between them. Now, sunlight provides nice shadowing, and we almost have to create that with paints a little bit on a model sense to get the same kind of look. So let's weather something. I'm going to have you look over my shoulder, and we're going to weather a refrigerator car. So we're going to start with the paints. Now, these Vallejo paints are some of my favorites. I use something called raw steel for some metal parts. There's something called old rust. It's in their gaming colors. It's a wash. If you put over any other color, it looks like there's a patina of rust showing through. It's kind of a neat color scheme. Flat earth and a gray-black color that's pretty nice. I also use craft paints. This one is called slate gray. I also use a sky gray. They're good for making aged wood. I have a few old Floquil polyscale colors sitting around. This one's called Sand, S-A-N-D. It's also available in other paint mixes, but it's just a light flesh color. It's very good for new wood. Of course, I use India ink. I will dilute it into alcohol. It's one of my favorite washes. I use some two paints, burnt sienna, raw sienna. Those are good rust colors. Raw umber and burnt umber are good dark brown, grimy colors. These are very useful. I also use pan pastels quite often. I like the black, the raw sienna, and burnt sienna. I wouldn't recommend any of the other colors. I just don't use them that much. AIM has some very interesting weathering colors as well. I love this Delta Dirt. This Delta Dirt stuff, if you dip that paintbrush into that and wipe it on a car, it just looks filthy. You feel like you got to go wash your hands after that. It's just really interesting, nasty stuff. And so there's some browns and some rust colors and some light gray colors that I use on a frequent basis. So if we look at these refrigerator cars, I love this picture here. These are single Herald cars, PFE cars, that were pre-war. It's a pre-war paint scheme, pre-World War II. You can see how the individual boards show up. And in this car, you can actually see very well where the door is. The door seams are shown as pretty dark here. Probably there's some sealant or something coming out. These, not so much, but I kind of like the way these doors look. So I'm going to kind of go for this look right here. And we're going to start with a red caboose car. This is my end product. I thought I'd show you this. This is where I'm going to end up trying to, this is what I'm going to try and achieve. So here we go. First thing is we're going to take the red caboose car, and before we build it, we're going to do some important things to it. These red caboose cars are really lovely kits, but they are cast in a plastic color that's appropriate for the car, but they're translucent. If you build the car as is, it almost looks like it's fluorescent. And the problem is this plastic is very translucent. You can see where the printed herald's coming through. You can see my finger holding it right here. And to fix that, the first thing I do is I begin to paint the inside with black craft paint. You have to be very careful about this. Just slob it in there and just get it all dark, get it all black. And you'll be amazed at how quickly it transforms that translucent plastic into something that looks a little duller, a little more realistic. Then we go after the trucks. Now, those of you who will notice, my paintbrush has been well dipped into the paint bottle, trying to manage the camera and show this picture and actually do this work while I'm taking the pictures. I wound up sticking the paintbrush way too far into the paint can. I don't usually use this much paint, but it still shows how I do it. I hold the truck in one hand, spinning the wheel, the opposite wheel with my finger, while I rest the paintbrush on the rim and the inside of the wheel. I just spin it around until I get it painted. And then I paint the truck frame as well. And I make sure I get the ends of the truck. So like I said, you don't have to use as gory a paintbrush as this, but it doesn't take a nice paintbrush either. Just kind of work it into the entire truck. Now I will take some of the slate gray and I will dry brush or lightly brush a coat on the roof walk. I want the roof walk to look pretty worn. And I'll put it on here in sort of an irregular pattern. It doesn't have to be very careful. Make sure you do the ends of the roof walk and do the sides of the roof walk. You don't want the gray paint sitting on top of the roof walk and the side being freight car color. You want the whole board to appear to be worn. Now, while you got the gray paint out, dilute your brush, dip your brush in a little bit of water and put some dilute gray on the ends and on the sides. Now, this doesn't look very good yet, but I'll show you how we're going to work that into the surface. Here you can see how I've done the whole bottom edge. Oftentimes these cars would weather from the bottom edge up, and the wood would begin to gray out a little bit. In this picture, I'm using a number 2 pencil, one of my favorite weathering tools, and I'm just running it along the seam where the door is. I want to bring a little bit of the door to the front and sort of illustrate where the hinges operate. Now, this is an important step. I have a very lightly colored wash that I mix with alcohol and India ink. I put maybe 2 or 3 drops per ounce of alcohol into the mixture. You can always do more washes, but I don't want one that's too dark. And I apply it with a wide brush. I get the whole car wet, and I keep the car surface horizontal while it's drying. That's very important. If you turn this car up on its bottom, the India ink and alcohol will run down to the bottom of the car and pool there, and you'll get a much darker tone along the bottom, and you'll hardly have any weather on top. So you want to keep this thing level while it dries. And what this is doing is it flattens all the sheen off of the plastic. It also drops some of the India ink down into the seams and gets that shadow effect where you can see the individual boards much better. Here I used a little bit of scrubbing motion with the alcohol, and I will begin to pick up some of that gray paint that's along the bottom here and bring it down onto the boards. And don't be afraid to dip this a little bit into that delta dirt and drag some of that around as well. Now, after I've done that, of course, I'm showing the paint drying with the car upright, and I shouldn't do that. It was already dry by this point, by the time I got the camera ready. So I want to tell you to ignore that. But I will also show you here how I'm using an abrasive stick, sanding stick, to kind of put some grain into the running boards. You don't want to sand off the little rivets that are at every cross brace, but you kind of work in between there to bring some of that car color back out and that sort of stuff. And I will use some of that sand color with a very fine brush and paint some boards in here. Now, if you want the boards to look like they were freshly replaced, leave it like this. By the way, paint the edge of them as well. I didn't want that look. I wanted to blend these individual boards in a little bit more with the roof walk, make it look a little older. So I put some burnt umber on the paintbrush, some of that tube paint, and just kind of dry brushed it across the top to put a little darker tone in there. Make it blend a little bit more. I decided the car wasn't grimy enough. I wanted to go through, and I put another alcohol wash on here little more India ink and alcohol on here, you can begin to see where the individual boards are starting to show up. But that's not really the trick. Oh, you want to do the underbody as well? I don't spend a lot of time doing underbodies. I find that when cars are in operation, people would notice it being shiny, but if it's kind of dirty looking underneath there, they don't spend a lot of time. So I'll put some grays and tans and rusts underneath there, enough to make it look dirty. Now, here's the secret. This fiberglass pencil I got from Micromart. They come in a variety of different versions, but I keep the end very short, and I begin to wipe downward along these boards, creating a little bit of texture to them. Now, keep the end very short and be careful of this tool. It's a nice tool to use. I use sticky tape to clean up my workbench afterwards because it'll break as you use it. And these little tiny hair-like bits of glass will come off of it. You need to be careful. You don't want to touch your face after you've done this until you washed your hands. Just be careful with it. You go vertical. Now, that's a critical skill about this, using this technique. You don't want to use your wrist turning it because you'll get a curved streak. You want to almost pull this thing to the edge of your workbench and use your shoulder joint to swing your arm back and forth and make vertical pulls, very light pulls with this pencil, going up and down until you get the whole thing kind of streaked like this. And that brings the individual boards out and makes the car very, it blends these paints we put on here earlier. Now, I do use a little bit of alcohol and India ink on the roof, and I will pick up some black or brown weathering powders on the paintbrush while I'm doing this to create some dirtier spots. Here you can see how I blended in that wood board that I had created just to create some variation in the roof walk. Now, this is what the finished car looks like when it's done. You can see how the gray has now blended in, how the streaking with the fiberglass pencil has lightened up the paint a little bit, factory paint. And you can see how the door looks here. I picked up the door. Now, using the fiberglass pencil brings out some of the door accents a little bit and some of the other details. It helps brighten those up a little bit and makes them look a little metallic. And here's on the end. I did streak through the Southern Pacific emblem a couple times just to show the paint kind of wearing off. I wanted a nice dirty look to this thing. These cars are not nearly as weathered. These are 1934 version box cars. Since I'm on 1939, these are fairly new. Again, painting the trucks, most important part of weathering. Alcohol India ink wash. I used some weathering powders. I applied them with a makeup sponge. And you can see it looks okay, but it looks a little bit bland to me. So one of the tricks I use is I use the alcohol to move the weathering powder around. And I will wash these panels with alcohol, pushing that weathering powder over and into the rivet lines. In fact, I'll even use some paper towel and wipe them down a little bit. And while I'm at it, I did the roof walk. So now I've got more of a paneled look here with the dirt clinging to the rivet lines and the panels being relatively clean, which is a nice look. I put a little bit of dust and rust colors on the truck frames. And then I used some of the pan pastels. I worked some more soot in along the roof here. I like them a little bit dirty on the top. And by rubbing this sponge back and forth, the rivet lines will pick up the black powder more so than the panels will. So that's how those got weathered. Now, wood-sided box cars get pretty grimy looking, and even in service, not quite this bad, but you still get a lot of grime. So here's a New Haven car I'm working on. This is 36-footer, and by the way, New Haven had an important shipper. I don't remember the name of the shipper, but they had their factory door set at 36 foot. So New Haven maintained a fleet of box cars that were 36-foot box cars well into the 1960s for this particular shipper. So these cars would be quite common. Acura makes a lovely model of this car. So I would recommend getting some of these, even if you're late transition era. But here I'm using a lot of gray paint on it. And once again, I use my fiberglass pencil to streak it a bit. Here we are doing this stuff. It ages the lettering and creates individual looking boards. So it kind of works out good that way. And I put a little bit of the alcohol India ink wash on the trucks as well to kind of bring out the kind of shadow the details a little bit. It kind of helps. and I use a little bit of rusty color, and I might do that while that alcohol is wet, so it grabs the paint colors a little bit more. Now this car, I'm going to have faded paint on the roof, so I start with any light gray or any silvery metallic color. If you get it too silvery, it doesn't look like galvanized steel. If you get it too gray, it doesn't look metallic. So you got to kind of work it with an in-between color. That steel color from Vallejo looks pretty good on this. And I decided I was going to make it rusty. And here I'm spreading some of the tube paints out and trying to build some rust up on the panels. This is not finished, of course. I'm still working my way through it. And I decided, well, I'm going to make it even rustier. So I pick up some weathering powders and combine them with the oil paint. So it's looking pretty rusty, but it looked too rusty to me. So then I started putting on some black soot. Now it looks pretty sooty, but it looked too dirty to me. So then I took an old paintbrush and began to scrub it. And I scrubbed through the soot and through the rust in some places and got back to the shiny metal. So I wound up with a mixture of roof textures on here. Now, none of these colors is wrong. You could go with a rusty color on top. You can go with a deep soot, or you can do with this blended color. Any of these is a good place to stop, and it might be a good idea to have some of each on your railroad. Now, here's some other roof work. This New York Central car is beginning to lose its paint, but not entirely gone. It's got some rust building up on the panels, but not too much. Wabash car has lost most of its paint on its roof on the galvanized metal, but it's still retaining some of the paint around the seams, which oftentimes was the way it worked with these Murphy roofs. So here's some other weathering tips and tricks. First of all, borrowing some of the techniques that military modelers use, you can weather with your primer coat. What you're looking at here is a hopper car primed with a dark coat, and then using an airbrush and airbrushing white on the panels. And what happens is when you apply your freight car color, it won't be that opaque that it doesn't carry through some of the light color on the panels, and you get this interesting weathering effect. That's a real good way to do it if you're decaling a car and you don't want to put a lot of weathering on top of the decals. This gives you a nice panel effect for hopper cars and for box cars. It's a great way to attack that kind of a problem. Gondolas are always filled with trash. I worked in one place where the hourly workers considered any empty gondola a good trash container, and they would dump all kinds of stuff into them. Lunch bags and dirt and old machine parts and whatever. But you can see gondolas were always messy looking. And unfortunately, the Walther's USRA gondola, which is perfect for my era, has a lovely exterior and lovely paint jobs, a nice floor, but almost nothing on the sidewalls. I think they made it too smooth. They made it so it would pull out of the mold easy, but that's the way it goes. So a good paint job plus some dunnage and trash in the bottom, and you can fool people into thinking it's more detailed than it actually is. Here's a whole bunch of those Walther's cars. I have a gondola train. This is just part of it that goes down into a steel mill, and I wanted to look pretty nasty. So here's a good collection of all kinds of dirt and grime. I just used some weathering, some scenery materials in some of these, like scenery dirt or scenery cinders, and glue them in with weathering with scenery cement. Excuse me. I'm focused on weathering. This was just dirt out of the backyard that I glued in here. It could be almost anything. And a little bit of tape cut thin is some banding, some old wood blocks. Great way to weather these cars. Flat car decks work the same way. Again, use sanding stick to add grain, and then paint them gray, and then add sand color on top for the lighter, newer boards, and some burnt umber to give it some brown tones. And use a fiberglass pencil to blend those colors together, bring it right across in parallel to the boards, and you can get a pretty good flat car deck. Here's a flat resin kit, excuse me, that I did. In this case, I scribed the sides. These were flat castings. Before I built the car, I scribed these boards on the inside, and I sanded it a bit to put some wood grain in it. I actually created some board ends. In some cases, I actually cut through the sides so you could see the interior through between the boards, and that looked pretty good. And I also noticed that these cars scallop between the metal posts. And you can do that with a sanding stick again, and then build the car and paint it, and it comes out looking like this. A couple weathering sins, of course. Definitely paint the wheel faces and truck side frames. Get that grimy looking. The painted lady effect where the weathering is, this is oftentimes, well, the weathering just shows on panels and doesn't show in the cracks. It's not sincere, if you will. This is oftentimes the effect of using powder weathering techniques and not really working it into the corners. And the third sin is probably too much airbrushing. This can look okay, but you wind up with a very artificial look. And one of the ways to fix the painted lady effect is, again, using alcohol wash. This car is just these panels dirty, but you don't see much grime in the cracks. You can wash it with alcohol and a paintbrush and push those pastels into the cracks, well, I say, and get a nice panel with dirty seam look. Here's another tip using a number 2 pencil. Number 2 pencil's got graphite, and it gives you sort of a metallic look when you rub it on some of these surfaces. I will hold the pencil on its side and rub it down the surfaces of the bracing on an outside braced boxcar like this, and create sort of a metallic look to those frame members. And in fact, if it's sharp enough, you can run the pencil down in the seam right here where the rivets are and catch the rivet heads and give them a bit of a metallic look. It's a very subtle effect, but it really helps differentiate the wood from the metal parts of this car. Now, I do weather everything. I weather buildings, I weather automobiles, weather my locomotives, of course. Even the standpipe's got some weathering on it. So everything gets a little bit of weathering. It helps it all blend together. And of course, don't forget locomotives and cabin cars. They should look pretty grimy. And even a railroad as fussy and as pristine as New York Central had their locomotives looking pretty dirty at times. I like my engines to be dirty. I don't like them to look worn out. I like them to look like they've been used pretty heavily. Cabooses, again, you have to be careful of decaled cars using that fiberglass pencil thing, but you can sometimes take a fine brush and get the board by board effect. Now, for a little inspiration, here's some other cars. Not all of these are mine. I want to point out some are from friends. I do like the way this car turned out. Nice rusty roof, excuse me, with wood boards kind of fading away. You can use that wood technique with a pencil on horizontal seamed cars. That works pretty well, getting some gray paint in there, so it looks like the wood's fading. This is a nice tank car. Not everything has to be terribly grimy. In this case, just the trucks and wheel faces got painted, and then a nice, and I think probably with an airbrush, this was done. This is not my railroad, but this is a really nice weathering job on the bottom of this tank car. It looks very realistic, I think. Oftentimes, the dunnage or the load in the car dictates how it weathers. This car is used to carry clay and other light-colored materials out of the northern panhandle of West Virginia, where there's a lot of light-colored clays, and of course that stuff would get all over the car as it was being loaded. Paint does peel. I love this car. Again, board by board, you can see the stuff, and you see the peeling paint. Kind of a cool picture. Here's some more models. You don't have to use the same color of freight car paint on each car. This is kind of a zinc oxide light orange color. This is a darker color that's shows a little bit grimier application of paint. And then, of course, here's a more reddish color back in here. These are all three the same color car, and they're the same car, actually. And it looks good having a little bit of variation in the paint. This is a Gym 6 model. I kind of like the way this looks. He did a good job getting dirt around the seams of the door and on the rivet panels and stuff. Just a general overall nice look to it. And it has a very, paint's a little faded here and there and that sort of thing. It looks very nice. This is a photograph, and I don't know the modeler that did this. This is really a beautiful job on the car. It's got light rust tones here where side supports join. Water would often collect at the bottom of these boxcars and would rust these parts of it. You can see this light metallic work on the hand grabs. I think that's very well done. He only has one mistake here, and it's an area that kind of shows the painted lady sin, and that is the inside frame of his door didn't get weathered. I think probably if he sees this picture, he's probably already gone back and fixed that. But that's something you got to watch for. You got to just kind of look a car over very carefully. This is a great looking model. And end of the line for this boxcar, probably it's running out of life. We can see the nice rust stains here and how the paint's bubbled and stuff. Really nice looking weathering job on this boxcar. Eric Hansman, excuse me, did this one. He said I could use the picture of it. I really like the look of it. He has a picture of the actual prototype where these boards were replaced. It looks just exactly like this. And of course, he's got nice chalk marks on here. Well done. A little bit of torn paper. This is really a nice car. And here's one by Charlie Duckworth. Again, working horizontally on the boards. So he brings those out very nicely. And then some darkness on the seal parts. Really nice looking car. I like this New York Central car. Again, this is a little bit too modern for me. This car is a 1960s car, so this would work for some of the diesel era modelers. But I like the way the rust tones were applied on the roof and how the rust spots appear in the paint. This is really nicely done, and the streaking around the door. So weather everything to some degree. I like everything a little bit dirty. This is a picture of my yard. This is the East End shifter. And you can see the caboose track here, and all the cars have some degree of weathering to them. That wraps up my clinic at this point. Are there any questions?
There are several questions.
Oh, by all means.
The first one is why pan pastels? AIM, Monroe, and Bragdon are so much better.
Well, it depends on what you want to use. And AIM is an excellent color. Pan pastels tend to be very monotone and not as well mixed color as some of the more specific weathering powders. And I kind of agree with that, but I like their black. And I will mix the pan pastel colors in with the other colors. Pan pastels tend to stick better to model surfaces. So I'll start with the black and then get that to adhere and then work the other weathering powders on top of it. And that works very well for me.
How do you suggest that couplers be weathered?
To use an old term, very carefully. It's very easy to lock a coupler in its a closed position and not have it operate again for the rest of your life if you paint too much on it. Very lightly dry brush some rust colors on it. I'm very careful about that. I do paint the brass springs a dark color. I find that a little bit of paint on the ends of the brass springs helps them stay in the coupler. But I like to get them sort of a blackish color, and I'm very careful about how I do that and dry brush most of it. And then when the paint's getting almost dry, I will flex the coupler to make sure it still moves correctly.
Mm-hmm. When you paint your wheels and frames, you use gray.
Yeah.
What about rust?
Rust on the truck frames, yes. On the wheel faces, not so much. They tended to be a very dark color in most of the pictures I've seen, unless the car is stationary for a long period of time. You put a new wheel in. Now, new wheels are rusty. I was around a lot of them. A pair of wheels and an axle weighs about a ton, by the way. But the wheel face on a new wheel, like say they replaced the wheel or replaced the wheel and axle set, would be rusty. But it would be rusty for maybe 2 or 3 miles before that oil spills out on it and it begins to pick up grime. So I'm very cautious about using too much rust color on a wheel face. But it does look pretty good at times.
You showed prototype photos of human weathering, like Kilroy was here.
Yes.
How do you model those effects on your cars?
I'm not 100% pleased with my outcomes. That's why I didn't mention them here. But I've used two things. I've used some decals, which tend to be very nice, but you sometimes can see a decal shadow around what's put on there. Even if you airbrush over it with a dull coat, you tend to get that. And if you put it on when the car is unweathered, which you should do because it should be shiny, it should be a shiny surface, then you weather it, the chalk marks tend to fade away. They tend to be weathered too. And I want my chalk marks to be like that Eric Hansmith car. See if I can come back up with it. I want my chalk marks to be brighter than the car's weathered surfaces. I've tried using a very sharp white pencil, and that's worked pretty well. So there's a couple approaches. Sometimes I even tried rub-on dry transfers, which I've had terrible luck with, but I'll get some marks out of them. That's the best I've been able to do.
So someone mentioned brown, black, yellow, and gray is pretty easy to weather, but how do you attack the green and red cars?
Oh, well, red cars, of course, they're painted with an iron oxide-based paint. That's where the red comes from. So putting rust on top of iron oxide makes it difficult. But the blacks come out pretty well. If you start with blacks and then you work in your lighter color rust, the raw sienna colors. If you want something rusty, that's fresh rust. That works pretty well. And the rust colors come out. Rust pastels or weathering powders work pretty well too. They're not too bad on those cars.
Okay, one more question about the wheels. Don't roller bearing trucks have wheel faces with a lot of rust?
Mm-hmm. You betcha. Steam era cars generally did not have the roller bearing wheel sets. The roller bearing wheels came in, I would say, in the 1960s. There weren't very many of them around before then. And they did have sealed bearings. You didn't get nearly as much oil splattering out behind the bearing on the wheel. So they do tend to be rustier.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you notice is that after like 1960 or so, many railroads use self-guarding frogs. And self-guarding frogs actually apply force against the rim of the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of modern cars will have shiny rims because they're going through those self-guarding frogs.
So someone asked, do you use any fixative as the final step?
Not very often. The alcohol India ink wash conflicts with dull coat. It will cause the dull coat to go hazy. Now, a new application of dull coat clears that up right away. But I oftentimes find that the dull coat makes the weathering powders, somehow it takes away from the weathering powders. I don't know if it blows them away from the surface or if it just hides their effect. But I generally leave things pretty grimy. And but I like my operators to come back upstairs after operating the railroad with dirty hands. That way they feel like they've been running a steam railroad, No, I'm just kidding about that. But I have considered putting coal dust on my throttles, on my Digitrax throttles, but no, I think I'll pass.
Same effect.
Yeah, just to get the right effect,
So how much do you hit with dull coat? Any at all?
I use it some cases. In some places, I will use it on once I decal a car. If I'm building a car and painting and decaling it, I will use it to decal it after decaling. But I prefer Vallejo or the old polyscale flat coats to dull coat. They have a better. I think they do a better job sealing the decals without causing you some chemical problems later as I weather with the alcohol and India ink.
Okay. So what was the India ink alcohol ratio again?
Oh boy, it's almost to feel. I guess maybe 4 or 5 drops per ounce of alcohol. I play with it. If it's too dark, I add more alcohol. If it's too light, I add more ink. I like it so that I don't notice it. It looks clear almost as I'm putting it on, but then after it dries, I look at it. I can see that it's settled into the cracks and crevices, and I can see some darkness in there.
Now, can you recover if you put too much ink on?
No,
No.
that's the problem. India ink is fairly permanent. Now, using that fiberglass pencil, you can scratch it off. But that's kind of abusive if you get too deep with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to let that India ink alcohol mix dry half done. You've got to make sure you cover the entire face of the car surface, because if you let it dry half done, you're going to have an
edge.
I guess a watermark there that you can't get rid of. So I've got to be careful of that.
And then the last question I see here, which might be, stretching the comfort zone, is would whether the steam era be different than the diesel era?
Yes, I think so. I think today railroads are much cleaner than they used to be. We don't have the air pollution. Steam locomotives are really, really dirty. If you've ever been around one, even miniature ones with coal fire, I've sometimes play on live steam railroads, and when you're done with a day of running a steam locomotive, you come out. You got to wear goggles, and you come out looking like a reverse raccoon with white eyes, a dirty face. I mean, it is a dirty, dirty um, means of transportation, and cars and things were just dirtier back then. I'm sure archaeologists, 1,000 years from now, will dig down there and they'll say, "Oh, here's the coal soot seam," and they'll say, "Oh, that must be the 1940s." Things were really dirty back then, and paints weren't as good, and we didn't have the metal products we have now that don't rust.
That's correct.
Look at your automobiles and stuff; they don't rust now like they used to.
So did you also mention weathering the track?
Not so much. I do think track's a model too, and should be weathered. It should be scale rail, and that sort of thing. But no, I didn't go too much into that. That's a little bit outside the scope of my 45 minutes here. Okay. I wanted to stay within my time frame. So.
Are you using the radle can of dull coat?
No.
Nope.
No. In fact, I try to avoid that. Mostly airbrush on a flat coat. I find rattle cans sometimes. Maybe it's just my enthusiasm for using them. I'll get drips. I just, one more coat. It's got to work better, And yep. So I find much better success from an airbrush than I do from a rattle can.
And do you have an expensive kind of airbrush?
No. Well, for years I used a Badger. In fact, I think I still have one. I think only recently did I buy a Pache, and it works pretty good. But most of the time I use an airbrush to paint the base coat on the car. Like these cabooses in front of you here have all been painted with an airbrush, but I weather with paint brushes, not with an airbrush.
Okay. So there is a question here that's kind of out of scope of the clinic. Code 93 or code 100?
Oh, there's no code 100 on my railroad.
Okay.
I think it's not only is it too tall, but the railhead is too wide. Now, I hope I don't insult people. I will never be critical of your railroad if you want to use code 100. But for me, my choice was to use code 83 in limited amounts on the main line, and code 70 and code 55, and there's even some code 40 on my railroad. I like the rails to look lightweight, and I don't like sometimes code 100 track looks to me like narrow gauge track because the rails are so heavy compared to the gauge.
Yep.
So hopefully people aren't checking out after I said that awful thing about code 100 rail.
Oh, there goes the viewership numbers.
Oh no.
Well, Bill, thank you very, very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was a lot of interesting facts and things. Someone even mentioned that you talk so fast they can't write it all down. So
I'm sorry.
I suggest that they press pause and they rewind.
Yeah. I do speak quickly, and I was trying to get through this in 45 minutes. I even know to stretch an hour-long clinic out to an hour and a half. So I can tell great stories and side things, but I've decided to stay very clean and very focused on this one. So my apologies if I spoke too quickly on it, but thank God we recorded it and people can go back and hear the nonsense I was spouting.
Yes.